Nice. Good morning. Thank you for coming. Looking forward to the topic, solutions for homelessness, and great conversation. I think it'll be a very good topic and an opportunity for discussion, and certainly an opportunity to really force us to focus and think a bit this morning. So welcome. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlene Wynne, who she and Zita have worked very hard to put this program together.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you all for coming today. So excited to have you with us for this meeting. How many of you are Long Beach League of Women Voters members? Great turnout. Thank you for showing up. How many of you are friends and family of Long Beach League members? Yay, thank you for showing up. And any community members who joined us today? Yay, you get extra points. Thank you. Gold star. So we are the League of Women Voters in the Long Beach area, and we help inform voters throughout our area, and also we encourage people to register to vote and do all of the activities to support voting rights throughout the area. We maintain a nonpartisan stance in all things that we do. We don't endorse candidates and we don't campaign for candidates. We just provide information to voters, and that's what we're here to do today. However, we do take positions on issues that align with our mission and our values. And so one of our positions that the California League and the local league have adopted is a position on homelessness. And we will share that with you today before we get into our program. So I'd like to introduce Zita, one of our members, who's going to share with you some information about the league's homelessness position.
As most of you in the room probably know, the League is a nonpartisan organization, which means it doesn't take any sides on candidates or anything of that sort. But while it is nonpartisan, it does take positions on issues, but it only takes positions on issues after it has done a study. And when I really joined the League at about the year 2000 or so, when I was with the LA League, I was so impressed with what I learned about the way they do studies. When the League does a study, they really delve into the issues. It's done by a committee, and the committee is usually self-formed, a committee that's very interested and concerned about an issue, studies the issues from all the angles, takes as long as they need to do that, and based on their study, come up with a series of statements of position that the League then confirms. So in looking into the lovely little booklet that was produced a couple of years ago for the Long Beach League, I checked the position on homelessness, which is just what I passed out to you. One of the things that's interesting, we think of homelessness as a new issue, a current crisis and so on, which it certainly is. But look at the year that the Long Beach League took their position on homelessness. 89-90. 89-90. Somebody did the math just here and said that's 30 years ago. It's ongoing, it's not getting better, we all know that. If you take a look at the positions, I started to erase my little pencil marks from my book, but I decided to leave them there because the items that I marked, and I'll explain why I marked question marks and stars. The League's position is we support the timely use of private and public funds and facilities to provide food, shelter, and rehabilitative services to the homeless of Long Beach. We also recognize that all levels of government must address the underlying causes of homelessness and the means of preventing it. Relevant today? I guess so. To this end, we advocate the following, and then it goes on to list these various things. When I got to number 3, a well-publicized information and referral resource easily accessible to those in need of help. As far as I know, the Long Beach League does not have such a thing, but I had previously belonged, you can't be members of 2 same local leagues, but I'm still a participant with the LA League. And a few years back, the LA League produced a booklet, Yes, in My LA, A Guide to Supportive Housing. It was based on a study. To me, it's a very impressive document. They use it for all kinds of meetings and so on. And I thought, well, let the Long Beach League take a look at this. Not such a bad idea. So that was one of the reasons that I put the question mark there. You'll also notice number 7, a manual for the training and use of those working with the homeless. Again, possibly a publication, possibly something that the league could do. The 2 items that I starred, an ongoing program for educating the citizens of Long Beach on the needs of the homeless. Particular attention should be paid to the basic causes of homelessness and measures to prevent and ameliorate it. And we have an expert here today in our speaker who is certainly going to talk to you about some of those issues. And then number 9, recognition of the responsibility of city, county, state, and federal governments working cooperatively for immediate and long-term solutions to the problems of the homeless. Long Beach City does have a lot of things going on. One of the things that I have been doing as a representative from the League is attending the Long Beach Homeless Coalition. And I would encourage, and I will be contacting some other potentially interested members, that we have more people who attend the coalition. The meetings are held on the first Wednesday of the month from 9 to 10:30 over at the Goodwill. I never remember whether it's the one on PCH, but I'll search my memory and get that information. It's not on Spring, might be on Willow. On Willow, thank you. That's why I say I search the memory. The meetings are amazing. It consists of representatives from all the various organizations that have any kinds of work that relate to homeless issues. We'll be talking about this, I think, a bit more later on, but I would seriously encourage those of you that are interested in this issue, attend the meeting, just sit and listen to the different organizations and the things that they do. But also, if you're an active league member, attend with the idea of, okay, what is it that the league can contribute to this issue? With those items, I'll turn it back to Charlene and the expert.
Sharing with us the homelessness policy of the league and your experiences working on this issue. We appreciate that. Today, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jordan Wynne was born in Long Beach, California. He attended Long Beach Public Schools, and he graduated from the PACE program at Long Beach Poly High School. After high school, he attended college in Portland, Oregon at Reed College, where he studied political science and public policy. He wrote his senior thesis on the impacts of gentrification in downtown Los Angeles. Upon graduating from Reed, Jordan came home to Long Beach. He's very passionate about his city, and since he's been back in Long Beach, he has been working as a community organizer with a couple of different nonprofits. I'll let him tell you about his current position and his current organization, and he's very passionate about housing issues and solutions to homelessness. And the presentation's working. Yay! Let's welcome Jordan Wynne.
Thank you. Wow, it's like she memorized a whole bio about me. Hi, my name's Jordan Wynne. As Charlene said, I am the Long Beach lead organizer for the Everyone In campaign, and I'd like to thank you all very much for inviting me to speak here today. It's wonderful to be speaking with all of you who are great, wonderful community advocates already doing wonderful work in Long Beach. I feel really privileged to be here, so thank you for having me. I have a presentation prepared for you today that kind of gives you a gist of both what the Everyone In campaign does throughout Los Angeles County, as well as kind of the state of the housing and homelessness crisis in Long Beach and what we're proposing to do about it. Now, as Zita said in the introduction, this is one of the stances of the League of Women Voters is promoting affordable housing where it can exist, and that's kind of our big thing when it comes to the Everyone In campaign. So we're going to be focusing a lot on those housing solutions today and how they relate to homelessness and why they're necessary. Now, this is part of a 4-part training that I do regularly throughout the community. We've been doing trainings throughout the year of 2019 in different neighborhoods. Our whole strategy is to try to do local advocacy because the people who are in the neighborhoods know their neighborhoods best, and they know how to help their neighbors best as well. So we've been doing these around town. So after this one, there is actually one coming up next Wednesday up at Grace First Presbyterian Church on Studebaker. So if you're able to attend that, I'll give you more details at the end of this presentation. But for now, let's get started. So I'm going to skip ahead from here just because we have a limited amount of time. So Everyone In is a community movement to end our homelessness and housing crisis, specifically by fighting for solutions around affordable and supportive housing. Now, we are a campaign that works across Los Angeles County, which means there are other organizers like me who are from different parts of Los Angeles who are doing this kind of work in their own neighborhoods. And our goal essentially is to activate the millions of people across Los Angeles who support real solutions to ending homelessness. Now, you may or may not be aware of some people, are very pro-housing, very pro-solution, and then there are also other people who, have some reservations around that. So we're trying to bring up the people, the majority of people who actually want to see these solutions manifesting. And what's been interesting about this campaign is that we've seen so many people coming out of the woodwork ready to actually do something about this. I think a lot of the times when we do these one-on-ones, we have people coming to the trainings because their biggest questions are, I see this every day in my day-to-day, in my neighborhood, people are suffering, I want to do something, I want to be a part of the solution somehow, and I want to know how I can help in a substantial way, not just a one-time, Band-Aid kind of thing, but something that's actually going to create real change. And that's kind of what has been the draw for a lot of people throughout our training series. So hopefully you'll get some of that knowledge today as well. This is kind of what makes up our core strategies at Everyone In. We focus on 3 big things when it comes to community organizing. We focus on the humanizing of the issue of homelessness. There are a lot of stigmas, a lot of misconceptions that just from the get-go make it difficult for long-term solutions to manifest. And a lot of those, just develop over time from what people have seen. And they are, they're stigmas, they're misconceptions, so they're not actually factually true. It's just what, appears on the surface. So we try and humanize the problem through storytelling, essentially. We utilize both a combination of facts and the statistics and the things that we know that work, and combining them with personal storytelling. I'll give you an example. There was somebody who came to our training a few months ago who was experiencing homelessness, and they had been homeless for over a year, which is called chronic homelessness, and they had 2 master's degrees. They actually used to teach at a city college. What had caused them to fall in homelessness is that they ended up getting in an accident which debilitated them. Their medical bills ended up skyrocketing. They weren't able to pay for rent, and lo and behold, that snowball effect left them on the streets. They've done the footwork to actually get back into housing too, of course, because they're well educated, they know what to do. So they got both rapid rehousing and Section 8 vouchers. And unfortunately, Section 8 monies ran out by the time that she got her voucher, so her voucher is void. And the rapid rehousing program is so far under capacity that her caseworker is not paying attention to her, she's not actually able to, get the resources that she needs. So she's done all the footwork. She's already where she needs to be in terms of what the system says she should do in order to get the resources and help to get back out of homelessness. But unfortunately, due to the gaps in coverage and the lack of funding that we have for our homeless resources within Long Beach, she's unfortunately still sitting homeless. And that's why we do storytelling, because I think even in that story, there's a lot of things that open up, like people stigmatize a lot of things around homelessness, around, laziness or other malignant qualities. But those things aren't really what make up the story of homelessness. Every story is different. And so what's important about this is that when we tell these stories, we raise the voices of the people who are actually experiencing this, and we start to break down some of the stigmas and the misconceptions that people have around the experience of homelessness. The second thing that we do is localize our organizing. So obviously, I'm the Long Beach organizer, born and raised here, so I know a lot about the community, and we really also like to tap into local communities and the knowledge that the neighborhoods have. That's really how we solve the problem. You can't just put a one-size-fits-all solution on the homelessness. You can't just say, oh, we're gonna put this here, no questions asked. Like, it's a community discussion, it's a community effort to actually mobilize around these new sites, these new solutions. And it's also a community conversation that's ongoing. That's why we've done these trainings in so many different places, and we'll continue to do that because we want to get more people involved. That's why we call ourselves Everyone In. And our third strategy is going big. So we want to have a big overarching narrative change when it comes to the experience of homelessness. As it stands right now, the resources that we have in Long Beach follow what's called a service-based model. And what that means is that the money that is put into housing homelessness is based primarily on services. So that looks like medical care, mental health care, all that other kind of stuff, right? But it's not attached in any way to housing. So what that looks like in practice is that you have people who are getting ad hoc services every now and again, but no access to consistent services. And especially when you place those services in overburdened crisis shelters, which is your typical idea of a homeless shelter, when you place those resources there, it becomes overburdened. There's not enough people to administrate resources in the first place. There's a high demand of people waiting down the street just trying to get service, and there's no consistent service because there's no guarantee you'll be able to get into the shelter at the end of the day. So we want to fill the gaps. Our idea of going big is we want to create systematic change. We want to shift ourselves from a service-based model where we have a lot of gaps in coverage and create what's called a housing first model where the first thing that we do is make sure that people have a consistent place to stay. It saves money, it saves time, it saves resources, and it saves people from the street. It actually works, and that's why we focus on that. It fills the holes and gaps in the process that we currently have, so that when somebody is either on the precipice of or who's just fallen into homelessness, they're able to actually find the route that works for them to get back on their feet and recover quickly. That's where we want to be. We're far from that right now. That's why we want to go big. That's why we want to change the narrative, change the system, and actually move towards a model that works for the 21st century. Now, I was talking a little bit about the people in the neighborhoods and how we localize our support and the importance of having that community dialogue. And one of the reasons we really value that is because I think a lot of times people feel relatively disempowered when it comes to speaking up, especially around more controversial issues. We also often tend to hear the more negative sides of things, especially when it comes to homelessness. A lot of people who have stigmas around homelessness, a lot of people who carry those misconceptions, also tend to speak very loud when it comes to homelessness. You may have heard of the word NIMBY before. It means not in my backyard. Many of that group of people, although it seems very loud and boisterous, actually make up the minority of the opinions that exist out there when it comes to actually providing these resources. Now, of course, that's boiling it down. There's a lot of nuance when it comes to conversations like that. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to actually gauge, okay, what does support latently look like in the neighborhoods across Los Angeles County? So we took a poll across Los Angeles County and we phrased the question like this. Suppose that there were a proposal to build supportive housing for the homeless in your neighborhood. If that were the case, would you support or oppose such a proposal? Now, just to highlight here, we phrased it very specifically in two ways. One is using the term the homeless. If you've noticed, I've used the phrase people experiencing homelessness rather than saying the homeless. And it's because we want to kind of, in a small way, change the stigmas about what it means to be experiencing homelessness. You are not homeless, that is not you as an identifier. You are just without home. you are without a place to stay. That doesn't define who you are. So that's why we're trying to make that language shift there to people experiencing homelessness as a condition rather than as a state of being. But we phrase it as the homeless here to kind of invoke, the classic, more conservative definition of homelessness. And then the second phrase here as well, in your neighborhood, is very critical because, people might be willing to build something, far away from them, but it's a whole different story when you're telling them it's gonna be in your neighborhood, it's gonna be on your block, right? And you might think, oh wow, like that would be, a lot of people would oppose that, right? Because of, all the stigmas that exist. But that's not the case. 70% of the people that we surveyed were actually in total support of building something like this within their neighborhood. That's a overwhelming majority. That's more than 2/3 of the people that we surveyed on this. And so that tells us that there's a lot of energy when it comes to actually creating these solutions. People are willing to see these things manifest. It's just about empowering people with the information and the stories that they need to actually organize and advocate for these kinds of things. We need to raise people's voices, and so that's what we're all about. That's what we're trying to build across Los Angeles County. 120,000 people who've already signed up for our campaign. So we're growing pretty fast. That's only been over the past year. So
In the county.
In the county, not in Long Beach. That would be wild. Long Beach, we have about 5,000 people who've signed up for our campaign, which is still great. That's still a very large portion of the city that's signed up to get, interested in this. So, with all that being said, by the way, I will be answering questions at the end too, so I'm gonna kind of breeze through this a little bit. If there's anything that's really pressing though, feel free to raise your hand and I will clarify. But I wanted to start here by breaking down, now that we've had a little bit of an introduction to the general campaign, some of the root causes of homelessness and the housing crisis that we have in Long Beach. Because they're very interconnected. Our homelessness crisis is actually our housing affordability crisis. That's one of the biggest drivers. I have up here the statistics for Los Angeles County, which over the past 17 years or so, the median rent in Los Angeles County has increased by 32%, and meanwhile, median renter income has decreased by 3%. So what that means is that housing affordability has become a huge challenge for people because their incomes have actually decreased, while housing has gone up about 32%. So they're really far apart. In Long Beach, it's actually even worse. That same rise in median rent took place over the past 10 years. So starting from this midway point. So if you can imagine here, going from that point up another 30%, and that's where Long Beach is. But our median income is about the same. It dropped about 3%. So we're experiencing a very drastic housing affordability crisis right now in Long Beach. And it's something that we've seen measurably in our homeless count. Every year we do a homeless count at one point in time of the year where we literally go out and we try and count as many people as we can find that are experiencing homelessness in Long Beach. And what we found this year, we'll talk about the statistics a little bit more, but an important number from that was 56%, over half of the people who are experiencing homelessness in Long Beach that were counted that day were experiencing it for the first time. And what that tells us is that this is one of the biggest drivers, because if you're falling into homelessness for the first time, more often than not, if it's such a large proportion, it's because there's not enough available for housing. There's not enough places that people can turn back on. And I used to work in tenants' rights and housing justice before this job, so I worked directly with tenants before they fell into homelessness. And there were many seniors and many students who were falling into this position because students are just starting to get to the workforce. Many seniors are on fixed incomes. And so one of the classic cases that we had was in the first district. We had a woman who was disabled, 72 years old. She'd been living in that apartment for about 25 years, and she had multiple generations before her living in Long Beach. She experienced an $800 rent increase. Yeah, and I know that figure sounds ridiculous, but to me, that was something that I was experiencing every day. We would have people coming in regularly saying, hey, I'm facing a $500 rent increase. Hey, I'm facing a $600 rent increase. In one extreme scenario, we had a family that was experiencing a doubling of their rent from $1,200 to $2,400. So this was a very typical circumstance that has been happening over the past few years in Long Beach. We don't have any sort of rent stabilization, so that practice was completely legal. Fortunately, that will be coming into effect at the beginning of 2020, so there will be stabilization of, there won't be extremes like that anymore, thankfully. But because of that, because we had such an open market, many of our seniors, students, and even working families were affected by those massive rent increases. Because you can't keep up with that, and then we don't have a healthy stock of affordable housing, so there's nowhere for them to go. except for the streets. And so that's what we saw happening in Long Beach. And hopefully, as we move towards solutions, we'll see that number decrease. An estimated 600,000 people across Los Angeles County spend 90% of their income on housing. Now, to put that into perspective, in order to be qualified as cost burdened by your rent, you're spending more than 30% of your income on your rent. So you can imagine how many more millions of people fall under that category when it comes to Los Angeles County. This is a crisis. This is what we're seeing. It's affecting everybody across the board right now. And unfortunately, we don't have the housing to make up for it right now. There's no safety net. People are at risk of being one paycheck crisis or emergency from homelessness, which is the case with a lot of people that I've met with over the past year, people who've come to our storytelling events, people, you know, the person I was telling you about before who had an accident and ended up on the streets. This is more and more often coming the circumstance as rents become more burdening. 53% of people across Los Angeles County said they were experiencing homelessness for the first time due to economic hardship. Now, in Long Beach, like I said, that figure is higher, it's about 56%. But this is just to exhibit that, like, across Los Angeles County, people are feeling the same kind of burden. I've talked about the rent side a bit, and I've alluded to this, but there's also not enough affordable housing that exists latently in Long Beach. Across Los Angeles County, we need over 516,000 more affordable rental homes to meet the current demand of very low and extremely low income households. Now, in Long Beach, breaking down those figures, we need about 5,000 more units to keep up with what our local demand says we need. This is according to the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA numbers. And unfortunately, if you look at the housing element for Long Beach over the past 10 years, since 2010, we've actually lost stock of affordable housing units. We've depleted our housing stock by 572 units. So we haven't made any progress. We've actually walked backwards when it comes to affordable housing. And it's only now that we're starting to work our way back to that 0 point, which is where we were in 2010. So we've made no progress in terms of building new affordable housing for our city. And that's an emergency. If we don't have the supply of affordable housing, then we're not gonna be able to have a market that is able to accommodate lower income and very low income and fixed income folks. We'll be missing out on a large portion of people who live and work in Long Beach. And unfortunately, the priorities of the city have not been on affordable housing either. We've mostly had large scale developments in downtown that have been speculative housing for people who don't live in Long Beach. And it's unfortunate. As it stands right now, our vacancy rate, which is the number of vacant units in the city, sits below 3%. And that's seen as not healthy for a cityscape at all. Most of those vacant units sit in that downtown area where those like high-end developments are. Nobody's bought those yet. So what that means is that there's a very large crunch for affordable and supportive housing throughout the city. One more thing I'd like to mention as well is that, like, we're seeing, like, if we're looking for like a true genesis of this, a lot of the problems that we see with the housing market came from the history of our housing market within Los Angeles. There's a persistent overrepresentation of Black people experiencing homelessness due to additional factors such as structural racism, housing discrimination, and mass incarceration. So as you might be able to see behind the words here, this is actually a map of old redlined Los Angeles back from the 1950s. This is, as I'm sure many of you are aware, how housing practices used to work, where people of color were discriminated against and put into specific areas of the city where they could live. Those things, even though those have been, since banned, there was nothing actually done to alleviate the effects of that. And so that is why we see a lot of gentrification today. A lot of that housing stock that was originally segregated was then not invested in. And now today it is very cheap land, very cheap housing that is now getting demolished. People are getting pushed out of those areas and out of their homes, and those are getting redeveloped into large-scale luxury developments. It's something that we're seeing actually happening in Long Beach's first district right now, which is our historic district. Right along the Wilmore corridor, a lot of those older apartments are depleting in value, and you're seeing a lot of lots starting to get refurbished or demolished and brought in for new luxury developments, or rents hiked up $800, $900 at a time. A lot of people that I was working with that had those massive rent increases were from those areas. So it's historically, this is the reason why. This is why it was built out this way, and there was nothing done to actually alleviate the effects of racism, and they still exist today. Black people make up 33% of the homeless population in Los Angeles County, while only making up 9% of the general population. So there's a consistent overrepresentation when it comes to Black people and people of color in general when it comes to homelessness. So I think those are three really important things to acknowledge when we're talking about root causes of homelessness and how our crisis has gotten so bad. So I wanted to break it down a little bit further now that we talked about the general root causes of homelessness and talk about the state of the crisis in Long Beach. We'll start at the LA County level and then boil it down even further to a minute detail. So you kind of get a general understanding of how Long Beach deals with the issue of homelessness, and it might surprise you. So in Los Angeles County, according to the 2019 numbers, we had 58,936 people experiencing homelessness. That is a 12% increase from 2018. So just from year to year, 12% increase. And this number alone doesn't encapsulate the full number of people experiencing homelessness across Los Angeles County, just like the Long Beach number doesn't. The way these counts are executed is they're done in what's called a point-in-time fashion, which means they're done on one day or 1 week of the year, where literally you try and count as many people as possible. Now, Los Angeles does have an algorithm that tries to calculate a few more people, but that being said, there are literally tens of thousands of more people who are trying to avoid being seen or less visible when it comes to homelessness. They actually make up the majority of people experiencing homelessness. People who are sleeping on couches, sleeping in cars, sleeping in places that are very hard to find or count where people won't actually search for them. People living in motels and on motel vouchers, so they're another qualifier. So there's a whole other subpopulation that goes uncounted, and that's the same for Long Beach as well. But with what's been counted alone, it's over the capacity of Dodger Stadium. If you want a visual of kind of what that looks like, the number that was counted would be overflowing onto the field. Every seat would be filled and people would have to fill in to the actual field itself. Now for Long Beach, our point in time homeless count numbers from this year counted 1,894 people experiencing homelessness generally across Long Beach. And within that population, there were 632 people experiencing chronic homelessness. Now, chronic homelessness is kind of what you would classically define as homelessness, what you probably see in your day-to-day, people living in tents long-term, people who have more debilitating circumstances such as mental or physical disability, sometimes substance abuse or other issues will abound as well. That is the number that we've counted for people experiencing chronic homelessness. Now again, just as a disclaimer, these numbers are lower than what the actual number of people experiencing homelessness are in Long Beach. Long Beach estimates there's about 4,000 people who experience homelessness every year in Long Beach across the city. But to put it into perspective, I personally think the number's a little bit larger because of just at Cal State Long Beach alone, there was a study that was done in 2016 that said that 1 in 10 students in the Cal State system experienced homelessness or housing instability within their time studying at university. So if you apply that to the population of Cal State Long Beach, that's 3,500 students. So alone, just from that campus, we have more than what was counted in the point in time homelessness count. And again, that's because of varying reasons. Oftentimes the homelessness that abounds, the larger number, is harder to see. And even in this number, we'll break it down a little bit more once we get to the explainers on chronic homelessness versus episodic homelessness. But even within this count, the majority of people experiencing homelessness aren't chronically homeless, if you'll notice. This is about 36-38% of the total number that was counted. The majority of people are experiencing what's called temporary or episodic homelessness, which is often due to housing instability. It's often due to housing affordability. So we'll take a deeper look at that in just a bit. Now, what is Long Beach currently doing to actually help combat homelessness and get people into homes? Well, interestingly, we have our own what's called continuum of care. So what that means is we are separate from Los Angeles County in terms of dealing with homelessness. We get our own federal funding from Housing and Urban Development, and we are charged with administrating our homeless services throughout the city of Long Beach. We are one of 3 cities across Los Angeles County where that's the same. Glendale and Pasadena also have their own continuums of care. But what that means is that we don't receive any direct LA City funding. We do sometimes get county funding, but it's very scattershot. Most of what we do and what we administrate comes from the federal government and administrating the funding that we get directly from HUD. So that's an interesting tidbit because I feel like a lot of people don't understand how like our actual homeless services system works in Long Beach. And it also answers questions around funding. You know, a lot of people are like, well, we have all of this money, like, why can't we use it for this or this or this? As you'll see in the next slide, the funding is relatively inflexible. A lot of the money that we're given from the federal government is for very specific means and can't be used for anything else. And that's what comes with running our own continuum of care. I'm trying to think if there's anything more important. I'm gonna touch on the Measure H slide here with the funding sources, just so I can break down kind of a little bit of what it looks like. Because I know there's a lot of questions that people have when it comes to how does funding work for our homeless services in the city. So they're primarily administrated by our Department of Health and Homeless Services through the Homeless Services Division and the Housing Authority in the city. And as I was saying before, funding is relatively inflexible. So just going point by point here, these two values are what's given to our continuum of care directly from Housing and Urban Development. Most of these millions are used specifically for services. They're delegated not for housing at all, not for housing solutions, but specifically for service administration. So a lot of that money will go to local partners like Mental Health America. It goes to running the MSC, which is our multi-service center. That's kind of the central hub of operations when it comes to homeless services in Long Beach. It's all over far on the west side of Long Beach. So most of that money goes towards services. It doesn't go towards any sort of housing solutions. Measure H. This was a countywide measure passed in 2016 that was specifically, again, oriented towards services that would go to different sources across Los Angeles County according to need. Now we do actually get Measure H services. We do actually get that funding from the county, and we're kind of the bad kids in a sense because number one, Measure H, if it was just up to Long Beach, it wouldn't have passed. It needed a 2/3 vote in order to pass across the county, and it did get that. It got 70%. But if it were only up to Long Beach voters, it wouldn't have passed. It got 60% of the vote. So our Long Beach voters didn't approve that. And in addition to that, we don't have to pay into Measure H right now because it's a sales tax. Long Beach has maxed out our sales tax already. So we're getting basically a free $5 million just injected in for services. So it's a nice benefit. But when you break it down and look at the details, you're like, hey, Long Beach, technically you don't deserve that, but like, here you go. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of a perspective as to like, what is the attitude of people in Long Beach when it comes to homelessness? Like, we hear a lot of noise about solving, the issue and actually, promoting these solutions, yet we don't see that same energy at the polls. What gives? Where's the disconnect there, right? Next we have on here, we have HEAP funding, which is just a one-time kind of payment that the state gives us. And that kind of lump sum funding is really great for us because it is flexible. So it immediately went into housing and shelter resources. A lot of that money went towards what's being built up in North Long Beach, the new year-round shelter is what they're calling it. That's going to manifest in about 125 bed spaces for people experiencing homelessness, which is good. It's good progress, but it is mostly a crisis shelter, so it will be overburdened. It does mean that there will be people lining up for that. Half of the beds are used for what's called bridge housing, which I will break down in a little bit. We're going to get to those solutions. There's miscellaneous county and state funding, again, mostly for services. And then the sole housing funding that we get for the city is the Housing Authority vouchers, which is specifically for Section 8. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that funding has already run out for the year. One of the reasons that is the case is because of the new regulations around Section 8 federally. They've maxed out the number at which, or the amount that you can charge for rent at like $1,600 per month. And so what that's resulting in is all the landlords who are accepting Section 8 are now charging $1,600 per month. They're maxing out the funding as much as they can because it's consistent and it is a bit above market rate. So that's what we're seeing right now. So that funding is going to get exhausted very quickly. And in addition to that, Section 8 is just relatively notorious for how bureaucratic and long the process is. It usually takes about 2 years for people to get off the list from Section 8 into housing. And when you're waiting 2 years to get any word on housing, you automatically become chronically homeless. That's not any way to actually administrate trying to move someone, who's just starting to experience homelessness due to housing affordability and then moving, to Section 8. You're just gonna be waiting on a list for 2 years. It's one of those things that makes people lose hope a lot of the time. So yeah, it's a relatively inefficient and ineffective kind of solution. Though it does house a lot of people, it just takes a long time, and it's a really like, clumsy kind of administrative policy there. And then we have a very small amount designated from our general fund for homeless service operations. So that's just like administrative costs, all the bureaucratic costs are wrapped up into that. So you might notice two big things when it comes to our funding here in Long Beach. Number one, there's not funding for housing resources at all, no consistent funding. And number two, there's no consistent local funding. We have that $1 million there, that's literally just for administrative resources. When it comes to actually providing services and providing housing for people experiencing homelessness, we have no local resources whatsoever, which when we're operating our own continuum of care, that doesn't really make very much sense. If it is up to us as the city to administrate these programs, we should be putting local funding and local dollars into administrating that program. But right now we aren't. So that's where we're at. That's what our funding resources look like. So we talked about the state of the crisis. We've talked about some of the roots, the root causes of homelessness. But now let's get a little bit more happy. Let's talk about the solutions. It does seem pretty dire. We are in a crisis, but there are a lot of ways in which we can advocate to actually end homelessness. And in a way that's not just like talking big. We're talking systematic change here. We're talking about actually, creating structural change and filling in the gaps that our city has when it comes to coverage for people experiencing homelessness in order to create these long-term solutions. That's what we're all about. Now, it seems kind of intuitive based on the name, homelessness, but homes end homelessness. And it's important to say because when it comes to the actual political inner workings of this, it gets muddled up. People don't really recognize this. But the first thing that you need to end your condition of homelessness is to have a home, have a consistent place to stay. And of course, studies show that when you have that home, it's much more easy to recover and get back on your feet, get working again, get the health you need, all that kind of stuff. And in addition, if we're thinking, non-empathetically more about what's in it for me, it's much more affordable. It cuts costs by up to like 50%. As to how the system works right now. So as I was talking about before, we have a service-based model and we spend a lot of money looking for people, literally trying to find people using our street outreach team. So, maybe someone's in one place one day and you're able to administrate services, connect them with some resources, all that kind of stuff, right? But then let's say, the police comes by and does like a debris cleanup around that area. They have to move, right? So next day they're not in the same place, they don't have a consistent address, maybe they don't have a cell phone. Don't know where they are. Oh no, well, that service connection has just become compromised. And that's something that we experience every day. So we spend a lot of money just trying to administrate a service-based model. If we move towards a housing-based model, if we move towards where our priority is housing people first and then administrating resources consistently, we save so much money. We cut that budget in half. And we end up having homes that are actually able to house people and end homelessness. We get people off of the streets. You're no longer homeless anymore. People say, oh, I don't want people experiencing homelessness living near me. It's like, if they're in a home, you're not experiencing homelessness anymore. You're in a house. And the great thing about this too is that, if it is somebody who needs more long-term care, there are housing solutions for that keep neighborhoods safe, that actually bring up property values, and that also help people long-term who have been experiencing long-term issues, they get the consistent care that they need. So let's take a look at those, Let's take a look at some of those housing resources and how they break down in terms of the different populations of people experiencing homelessness. So about a quarter of the population experiencing homelessness, it's a little bit higher in Long Beach, about a third of people experiencing homelessness in Long Beach experience what's called chronic homelessness. As I was saying before, this is kind of classically what you associate with homelessness. It's long-term homelessness, and it's people who are experiencing more acute issues when it comes to healthcare and job services, all that other kind of stuff. There's a lot of things that you need if you've been experiencing homelessness for a long time. First and foremost, documentation. One of the first things you lose when you fall into homelessness is your documents. You don't have places to safely store things. Things get stolen very easily on the streets, so it's very likely you've lost your social security card, your birth certificate, identification, other important documents that you might need, medical records. So part of the importance of aiding people experiencing chronic homelessness is making sure that they have all of those things collected together, right? That's part of the service element. And then the other thing is, of course, dealing with longer term problems, such as mental, physical health ailments, other things like that. Now, I do want to put a disclaimer out there. I'm kind of teasing content from our next training, the 201 training. But the most common mental disorders that people experiencing homelessness have are anxiety and depression. And a lot of people have these misconceptions that like it is those mental disabilities that push people into homelessness, but it's more often than not that we found that people experiencing homelessness develop these mental disabilities as time goes on, because it's really taxing to live on the street. Think about it this way: if you have nowhere to go and you have nowhere to sleep, you have no bed, you are not getting a consistently good night's sleep. Oftentimes you're asked to move multiple times per night. Maybe you're trying to sleep during the day. You're not on a comfy bed, you're sleeping on the pavement or something like that. And just think about doing that for a year, right? Just over and over and over, and how taxing that is physically on you as it is. So it's no question that that would also be mentally taxing in some way or another. And another point is people who are experiencing anxiety and depression are also housed. There are a lot of people who are housed, probably the majority of people experiencing that actually do have a home and have a safe place to stay. So I say all that just because like a lot of people have that kind of idea that, you know, when we're dealing with homelessness, we're dealing primarily with a mental health crisis. And that simply is not the case. That's not what the numbers show. So when we're trying to help people that have these more long-term chronic issues, what are the solutions that we use? Well, ideally, we want to move people from the streets and we want to get them into what's called supportive housing. Now, I'm going to break this one down a few times just so you understand fully what it is. But essentially, supportive housing is affordable housing with supportive services on site. So it is an actual unit that you sign a lease for, that you own, that you rent, that you live in. You pay a portion of your income to that, pay rent, and it usually, you know, over time will ratchet up as you actually, you know, get an income. And while you're there, you have supportive services on the site. I'll give you two examples. One is a very large supportive housing campus across town called Century Villages at Cabrillo. Has anybody heard of that? Yeah. Yeah, it's a really wonderful facility. If you haven't been there before, I recommend you visit because it's just beautiful. It's lots of really large modern architecture, great courtyard spaces, large community spaces, a community kitchen. There's a lot of really great things on site. And what you have on there is a multitude of major job, mental and physical health care facilities that have located themselves on the campus as active resources for the tenants that live there on the campus. Another one that's actually being built right now at 20th and Long Beach Boulevard is called the Spark at Midtown. It's being built by a developer called Link Housing. And they have envisioned a wonderful kind of central Long Beach community space. They're calling it the Spark because that's oftentimes what supportive and affordable housing acts like in the city center. They referenced Gaslamp actually in San Diego. Back in the 70s, it was a very destitute kind of place. Really grimy, lots of rundown housing, not a great place to be. We had affordable and supportive housing developers come in there in that time, and now it's literally transformed into kind of the tourist capital of San Diego. This is where a lot of that activity happens. It's right next to the convention center. It's just a very popular, very beautiful district. And it all started because supportive and affordable housing developments moved in there and anchored themselves as a part of the community and helped the community. That's what the Spark intends to do as well. They have a YMCA that they're building on campus because they are meant to help, you know, facilitate and bring back families as well. They're gonna have a cafe there called Cafe 123, which serves as both a jobs training center and a really great cafe. Try their cookies, they're very good. And Mental Health America is also gonna be operating a facility out of there as well for mental and physical health care for people who are living at the development. And in addition to that, they're gonna have a court amphitheater and stuff. It's gonna be just a beautiful community space. And I'm really happy it's getting built because that lot that it's being built on has been empty basically my entire life. So I'm happy that something that's actually gonna give back to the community is gonna be there. So I go on that long ramble because I think a lot of people have a tough time thinking that there's more housing than just shelters, and there are, and this is what they are. This is what they look like. They're not anything like a shelter at all. Supportive housing doesn't have people lining up outside. It is your unit. You go there every night and you go to bed. This is your place to stay. This is your place to live. It's just like having a nice, affordable or regular housing development in your city. And it also looks beautiful. All of these are built with contemporary architecture, so they're very pristine looking. They blend into the neighborhood very well, and yeah, they're just awesome. I would live in one very, very readily. They're very beautiful units. The majority of people, though, experience what's called first-time temporary episodic homelessness, also known as short-term or what I like to call invisible homelessness. These are people who are much less visible to the general population and don't have those chronic ailments or disabilities or other things that they need help with. Oftentimes they just need a leg up. They need the resource to connect with affordable housing. They need a job resource to get back on their feet and get paid again so they can pay rent. It's often they need 1 or 2 fixes. Unfortunately, this is something that our city doesn't do very well with. These are people who are just kind of falling into homelessness for the first time, right? Who have experienced homelessness, maybe for a few months or a few weeks, right? The thing is, we don't really have much more of a point of entry than the coordinated entry system. And given that our system is overburdened and does not have local funding, we don't have the number of caseworkers to actually handle people falling into homelessness for the first time. Additionally, our system prioritizes people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, and because we have a large number of people experiencing chronic homelessness and our service-based model takes a lot of time to outreach to them, we don't have the capacity to actually handle a lot of people who are falling into short-term homelessness. So what that looks like is that this large population is then shifting over to experiencing chronic homelessness. We're generating long-term homelessness because of the way our system works right now. As I shared earlier, 56% of people experiencing homelessness in Long Beach were experiencing it for the first time. We don't want to see that mass wave of people on the 2020 count experiencing now chronic homelessness, but that's likely what we're going to see because we don't have those housing resources there. So what do people experiencing first time or episodic homelessness need most often? Well, most often they need a way that they can get rapidly rehoused and placed into some affordable housing development. Or they use, a rapid rehousing program also will help pay for your rent on a unit. So maybe they just need to find a unit that will accept them and pay their rent for 6 months, get back up on their feet. The capacity for both of these is very low right now in Long Beach. With this, there's only 2 sources of rapid rehousing in Long Beach. There's PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. They do a families program for 33 families a year. And unfortunately, the way that because there's such little capacity organizationally, they don't outreach very much to people. And so there was actually funding that went back from those rapid rehousing programs this year, which makes no sense. There are definitely families in need for that, but they didn't have the capacity to actually outreach to the people and say, hey, this is available, come to us. There's another rapid rehousing program I'm trying to work with right now with someone who's experiencing homelessness that is just so deeply under the capacity. They have 1 caseworker for an ongoing rapid rehousing program. They have consistent funding, so they could fund a multitude of individuals who want to get back on their feet, but they just don't have the capacity. They don't have the funding to do that. And then additionally, we don't have the stock of affordable housing, as I was saying before. We've lost units of affordable housing. So even if we're trying to rehouse someone into an affordable unit, they're just not here. We can't place them in Long Beach, which is especially difficult because we have our own continuum of care. If we wanted to place them somewhere in Los Angeles or somewhere outside the city, which is generally not our practice, they would have to then go onto the Los Angeles waiting list and wait however long that's going to take to get back into their system. So you can see where the bureaucracy kind of slows it down a bit, but you can also see that the fact that we don't have the latent resources in our city is causing a crunch. It's causing this problem and continuing to worsen it. So that's why we need affordable housing as a mainstay when it comes to solving this issue. So let's break it down a bit. I'm going to show you a little bit of what each of these housing types look like. I didn't talk very much about this one, but it is important. It works very well for that middle step between rapid rehousing and affordable housing, like getting people who are experiencing episodic homelessness into homes. It's called bridge housing. It's housing that provides short-term stays and various services to people experiencing homelessness. Now, it kind of looks like a shelter, and it's similar, except for instead of having to line up for a bed space every night, once you get a bed at a bridge housing facility, you stay in that bed until you get rehoused. So you don't have to worry about trying to find another space, trying to line up every day. You will consistently be there. You will have access to a caseworker every day, as well as access to services on site. So you will be getting that consistent service. But it's meant so that you can then move forward into an actual apartment somewhere that you can actually live. That's how it's meant to function. As our capacity stands right now, what will likely happen is that we will have people prioritized on vulnerability factors, specifically people experiencing chronic homelessness. Because we just have such a large latent population, we don't have the housing resources on the ground yet to permanently place people. So I was talking about the Long Beach development that was happening up in North Long Beach. That's going to add about 125 bed spaces. Half of those will be dedicated bridge housing, which means they will be consistent for the people who actually get those. Now, because we still have a service-based model in Long Beach, what that's going to look like is we are going to serve the most vulnerable first. So people experiencing chronic homelessness will likely get those bed spaces first. But ideally, if the system is functioning, at its capacity that it should be, this is most useful for people experiencing temporary or episodic homelessness, just generally as it operates. But it's good that we have more space opening up as it is, because we're dead. Then we have supportive housing, which again is affordable homes combined with supportive services. Now these are mandated affordable homes. These are actually covenanted, so that means that you'll pay probably about 30% of the income you make towards your rent. You sign a lease and you abide by house rules, so it's very secure. There's security constantly on site, professionally trained staff on site as well. And it is, as I said before, meant to serve the most vulnerable population, so people experiencing chronic homelessness. Now, just as a little tidbit of information, we did a survey of a development that was built up in North Hollywood, and there was a lot of opposition at the beginning from certain NIMBY groups against this particular supportive housing development. So we built that, and then we went back 2 years later and we surveyed the neighborhood. Like, how has your neighborhood changed since building this? Like, what does this look like? How has it affected you? All those kinds of different questions. And the main response that was gotten, the majority of people answered that they didn't even notice that this was a supportive housing development. They didn't notice any change really to the neighborhood whatsoever. And in fact, the other thing that we found was that property values had actually increased in the neighborhood because you no longer had people experiencing homelessness on the streets anymore. You now had people housed. It raised property values because the neighborhood beautified. It looked better. That's the case with a lot of places around Long Beach if we're trying to think of where we can build these kinds of things. There's certain things that come to mind. You know, most often I think of nuisance motels along the Pacific Coast Highway corridor, Anaheim corridor, that are really defunct. They're really not well managed, and they, as Rex Richardson said, are cash cows. So oftentimes they will just take these vouchers and not actually, have any resources on site. People will be living in very unsafe, unclean environments. And generally the neighborhood also is affected. It's not good at all for the local neighborhoods. So if we, took eminent domain or purchased those properties and then converted them into supportive housing where we had actual consistent services, good and well-maintained buildings, modernized buildings, and central hubs for people to actually receive these resources, not only would we be helping people back on their feet and giving people substantial resources, but we would also be improving the property values within the neighborhood and improving generally things in terms of safety and other things like that. It would just make the neighborhoods better. Excuse me, by the way, I realize this is going off, so I'm going to turn this on. And finally, affordable housing. Actually, this slide as well. This just further breaks down the benefits of supportive housing, but I think I've harped on it a lot. The one thing I guess I haven't really said very much is that 90% of people who go through supportive housing continue to retain that housing. And it's oftentimes even higher than that. With Century Villages in Cabrillo, they have a 96% success rate of keeping people out of homelessness for good. Now compare that to crisis shelters. Crisis shelters are like 5 to 10% at best. They have a lot of recidivism back onto the streets. So that's one of the reasons that we really advocate for this, is because it has a track record of working for people. And finally, we have affordable housing. This is where rent should not cost more than 30% of a household income. This is what most of them look like nowadays. They're very beautiful buildings, lots of effort put into them across all of Los Angeles. The Spark at Midtown actually looks very similar to this render. This kind of center space turns into like an amphitheater space and a community garden, which is really nice. This is the kind of stuff we're seeing going up that is affordable housing across Los Angeles, and it really, really helps revitalize the neighborhood, makes things look a lot nicer. Now, in order to do all of this, one of the critical needs that Long Beach has, in contrast to the rest of Los Angeles, is funding. Los Angeles has local funding for its homeless services. It actually just passed something called Measure Triple H, which was specifically dollars going into housing development, and it was meant to build 10,000 units of supportive and affordable housing. Now that is a city initiative, so what that means is that Long Beach doesn't get any benefits from that whatsoever. As I've made pretty clear, we don't have any sources of local funding. And in order to make up this gap and actually get the funding that we need, we're going to need a local source, because there are, as it stands right now, no other sources for housing funding in Long Beach. So the city of Long Beach estimates that we need about $245 million total to actually maintain and achieve the goals that they've set out. Now, this is was within their Everyone Home Task Force report from the end of last year, which was a board of a bunch of people across the city, and they projected that this would give them 350 supportive housing units, 450 bridge housing or rapid rehousing units, 500 shelter beds, and 2,400 rental subsidy units or Section 8 units. Now, I just have two things to say about these figures real quick. Number one, I just think that we shouldn't stop at 350 considering our number is 638 that we've counted of people experiencing chronic homelessness in the city. We should probably build the number of units that it requires to get people off of the street rather than stopping short. We've stopped short for so many decades, and as our housing assessment numbers say, we're going to continue to have more housing demand in the city. So we should probably make up for lost time and try and get those units on the ground more rapidly. And that goes for basically everything on here. Same when it comes to funding. I think $245 million is a very conservative estimate of what it would actually cost to end homelessness in Long Beach. I think that our city needs to throw down a little bit more when it comes to actually funding and homelessness. We don't have any local sources, and I think we have the opportunity to generate a good amount of revenue to actually put an end to this. If we're gonna invest in this and actually look for long-term systematic solutions, you're gonna wanna spend a little bit of money to make sure it's actually a good program and not something that's shoddy or has gaps. We're trying to end the gaps. We don't want the gaps to continue. So what's the plan to win? What are we actually doing as part of Everyone In to get to that point? Well, really, the whole point, in one way or another, is to organize. We want to make sure that we're bringing the community together to actually advocate for these things. The city's not going to act if we don't raise our voices and actually say, hey, we need this consistent funding. And it's also more likely than not that some sort of funding source for people experiencing homelessness would go to the ballot. It's very likely that that would be the case. Based on the nature of funding mechanisms, whether it's a bond, parcel tax, or other thing, oftentimes when it comes to those funding revenue sources, the voters are going to need to approve that, right? So that's why we need to organize. That's kind of what we're building up when it comes to the Everyone In program in Long Beach, is we've been reaching out to a lot of different community groups, nonprofits, churches, other organizations, and working in each individual district to try and organize people around these solutions and get people ready and trained up. So we do everything from canvassing, mobilizing house parties, training, civic actions at city council, phone banking. We do supportive housing tours. We've done a training at the Central Villages of Cabrillo to show it off to our different neighborhood leaders. And we've also built out a neighborhood leader program that takes into account each of the individual districts of Long Beach and brings together local leaders from those areas to talk about these solutions and advocate within their own neighborhoods. So that's our big strategy, is organizing. Now across Los Angeles County, we already have 6,424 units of supportive housing approved. I actually think that number has gone up now to 7,000 recently because of the recent advocacy that happened at City Council. We had a whole group of people across Los Angeles County come in and advocate for an additional 3,000 units of supportive housing. And what that looked like was a whole community of people, literally 500 or so people across Los Angeles, filling the City Council chambers with Everyone In signs and saying, hey, we want this. I'm speaking in public comment. We need this. It's been long enough. We're so far behind with the housing resources. We need to catch up as rapidly as possible. And I support this in my neighborhood. I need this. We need this as a community. So that's how we've made so much progress. That's what's happening in LA, and that's what Long Beach needs to do. Within Los Angeles County, we've had 1,812 new units of supportive housing already under construction, and more of those are coming online every day. In Long Beach, we have 120, I think, new units coming on of supportive and affordable housing total. Now keep in mind, I said we lost 572 units of affordable housing over the past 10 years, so we still have a while to go to get to that zero mark again. So if we can make up that momentum, that's gonna be really vital for our movement, and so that's what we need community members for, to organize around these kinds of sites. I'm gonna skip ahead from this one, if it lets me. So, just a little visual. These are all my different friends across Los Angeles who are doing this kind of movement with me. We have organizers all around Los Angeles that are focused in on each of their individual groups and turning out these kinds of people to go to civic actions, to turn to the polls, to influence their elected officials, to really target the people who are going to make the decisions as to whether or not we get these resources and making sure that we get these resources. So what can you do today in order to actually start becoming an advocate? The first thing that you can do, the easiest thing, is talking to your friends, family, coworkers, and neighbors about what you learned here today, and generally about the Everyone In program. We want to, one of our most important ways of spreading is by word of mouth, and we want to build out a network of individuals that are informed on these issues so that we can start to break the stigmas around them. The first step is actually having that conversation, saying, hey, actually, I found out that rents over the past 10 years have gone up by 30%, and that 56% of people experiencing homelessness were experiencing it for the first time in Long Beach last year. It's stuff like that kind of start to shift people's minds. And then the next training that we do next Wednesday, we're going to be talking a lot about how to actually talk about homelessness. It's one thing to learn about it, but it's another thing to actually convey that information in a way that actually helps change hearts and minds. And it's a lot more than just throwing statistics at people. I'm sure in any Facebook or Nextdoor argument you've been in, if you've thrown a logical argument out there, it doesn't actually do anything. It's like, hammering at a brick wall, right? The important thing about changing someone's mind is that it doesn't just take facts. It takes stories, it takes empathy, it takes being able to walk in somebody's shoes and understand what is the actual issue here, what am I advocating for, what's in it for me, and how do I actually help. So that's what the focus of our next training is. I really hope you will join us at the next Everyone In event. It's happening next Wednesday, November 20th at 6:30 p.m. and it's happening at Grace First Presbyterian Church up at 3955 Studebaker, so real close to where Studebaker and Los Coyotes combined. That's where it is. And yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about. And then, as I said, it is a 4-part series. So after that training, there will be a few trainings in December. We're trying to do a round of trainings before the end of the year, because once we get to January 2020 is where the real work begins. That's where the political advocacy is going to start. That's where we're really going to start going to council. That's where we're going to start going to the people and start talking to people very substantially about, hey, we need you to pass this. We need you to vote for this. So there's a lot of ways that you're going to be able to get involved in 2020. But if you want the full picture, I definitely recommend that you go to these trainings. But aside from that, that's about all I have. I have cards and stuff for my contacts, but I'm going to leave this screen up so you can take pictures, save the date, all that kind of stuff. But thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Where does Link Housing get their money?
Mm-hmm.
Aren't there tax benefits? What are the real incentives to a private developer to build whatever affordable is here? I don't know, but
yeah.
You're gonna have to look beyond trying to get another bond issue on the local ballot.
Yeah.
Or we're up to here on sales tax. We aren't going to get from there.
Yeah. So we actually had a really great presentation with Link Housing a few months ago, where the COO, Sunil Chang, talked about the process of actually building supportive and affordable housing. And I actually, at the beginning of 2020, am planning on trying to do another series of that, so you can kind of understand a bit more of the breakdown on that. But yeah, you essentially alluded to kind of how the process works, is that it's mostly a tax incentive-based relationship between the nonprofit developer and some of the funders that they seek. Typically, banks are some of the largest funders. I know that U.S. Bank and Capital One and a few other companies are some of their largest funders. Now they are a statewide organization, which means they build not just in Long Beach, but they build all across California. And one of the things that they say during the training is what makes them more competitive in terms of actually being able to outbid other developments, in terms of actually being able to build affordable housing on the site, is an injection of municipal funding in some way or another. That is kind of what gives affordable housing developers the edge, because tax credits do go a good amount, but in order to actually show that they're going to get a return on the investment, showing that they have a little subsidy from the city actually creates that kind of critical difference there. So that's the importance in terms of a local funding mechanism. In terms of what the funding source is, now that's more up to debate. We may or may not be advocating for a bond. I don't know what it's going to look like. That's still in development, and we want community input as to where we get the funding from. Personally, I think we should be delegating more of our general fund towards this, given that it is a crisis. I think it makes sense, but that's everybody has a different outlook in terms of the funding source. So that's why we're bringing this to you early, so that y'all can be a part of that conversation. So that once we do get to the policy making stage, which will be over these next 2 months, you can, you know, voice your input, and we want to bring that into the creation of the ballot. So, yeah.
A lot of what I hear about when I hear about homelessness is public health crises, right?
Yeah.
The bringing back of the Black Plague and things like that.
Definitely.
Where does that come into when you're trying to advocate for more money and funds for, because obviously putting people in homes will get them off the street, will get them away from rats and, you know, all the things that can perpetuate that, right?
Definitely. Well, I mean, and a lot of what we advocate for in our housing is service-based unity. That's why our biggest push, like when it comes to our organization, is definitely supportive housing. We really believe in that model because it's the best of both worlds. You don't just throw everybody into housing unsupported, you know. Every story of homelessness is different, and so when we're dealing with people who do have larger healthcare issues, we want to make sure we give them the resources that they need. So that's why we advocate for supportive housing so hardcore. But the other thing is the public health element is part truth, part perception. There are some overdramatic statements. We cite that Black Plague statement in our 201 because it's an overblowing of like the idea of like what it means to be homeless, like, and experience homelessness. It's more a messaging thing than it is actually like, you know, a statistical thing. There are people who are experiencing chronic homelessness that do have health issues, but people experiencing chronic homelessness also make up the smaller proportion of people experiencing homelessness, and within that, physical ailments make up a percentage of that percentage. So it's oftentimes, you know, closer to about 20% or so that people are experiencing these more severe mental or physical health ailments. In Long Beach, I believe that's around the statistics. About 20% of people are experiencing some sort of mental or physical ailment on the street. So with that population, we want to make sure that we get them into supportive housing, we get them the resources that they need. And more importantly, you know, that we get them consistent resources. One of the biggest problems with the way we administrate our programs right now is that we just don't have the capacity, and we spend a lot of money on trying to outreach and get people into places where they can receive services, but we don't have enough places where people can receive services consistently over time. So that's kind of like how we address that. You know, we do prioritize housing a lot, and it is just based on the metrics. It's based on what we found surveyed time and time again. But for those that are experiencing, you know, health issues and you know, when it comes to the actual public health crisis element, we want to make sure that those services are available and work most effectively.
So at one of the trainings that Jordan conducted earlier this year, the City of Long Beach Health Department Homeless Services Bureau manager attended the training. And during the discussion, the question was asked, and it was admitted that we do not have enough housing vouchers to give people even 1 day of housing versus long-term housing. They've got all these services, but the reality is you can go to that multi-service center for services, but there's no guarantee that they will put a roof over your head that night. We just don't have it.
And I think what I was getting at too was that if you're living on the street, then your trash is living on the street, and that's kind of where the public crises as far as health, because there's trash, and that's where the rats come in, and that's where things perpetuate. Not necessarily that the person is ill, but that's happening. And so having a house and getting people off the street and their trash off the street would be huge impact on that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and it can even be reduced as quickly as like having consistent places where people can store their things, first of all, because half the time, some of the things that are there are actually, you know, like valuable things, like their documents or the things they're trying to keep hold of. And then yes, when it comes to like trash, I mean, number one thing that Long Beach can do is just add more trash cans generally. It's so difficult to find public trash cans around the city, and I think it's just because they don't, again, have the capacity. Capacity is a huge issue when it comes to our city's administration of these programs. So there are ways, I think, in which we could be spending our money better, and I think we should make our budget more effective and efficient. But there's also just generally a lack of funding when it comes to, these more consistent housing resources where we could get people off the street, trash off the street, other things like that off of the street.
So, I am a animal person. Do you guys ever talk about people who lose their housing and then have animals? I mean, I know.
Oh, yeah.
I don't wanna hear about, we've got a place to go. Do you guys ever talk about that, or is that an issue that's never?
Oh no, that happens all the time. In fact, that's something that actually Long Beach has identified as a specific issue. At their new shelter that they're building, the year-round shelter, they will have facilities for pets, so that
They do actually consider that.
it is actually, yeah, it's a consideration, especially because many times people who fall into homelessness, their one companion is their pet. They keep them with them, and it can be very jarring to move to a shelter if you can't take your pet in.
Yeah,
So
knowing
that's
that the pet's gonna end up in.
on the street, or in a bad situation. So that is actually a priority consideration that the city has taken into account, and it's what we're seeing in a lot of supportive and affordable housing developments, that they're also pet friendly. They allow those. So yeah.
Question, does your organization collaborate with other local organizations like Salvation Army?
Yeah, we do. We're actually, in addition to this community outreach, portion that I do, which is kind of my biggest part of the job, the other part is working with local nonprofits, other organizations throughout the city, and we're constantly outreaching to make our network bigger. We have a lot of nonprofit affordable housing providers, service providers, churches, activist groups, all those other, just extraneous people who want to get involved throughout the city that we work with that are already on our team. But we're constantly looking to outreach and talk to more people. So if there's anybody that you want me to talk to, or that you think would be a beneficial connection for us, please let me know. I'm happy to make an introduction, give a presentation, or just have a chat about kind of what we're doing in Long Beach. I know you had another question.
That was it.
Oh,
Thank you.
So do you guys interact with other states? And the reason I ask this is I grew up in the Midwest. So in
Yeah.
Minneapolis, in the middle of winter, when it's 60 below,
Oh, yeah.
you're not gonna have people on the streets.
No,
They
definitely.
may be under the bridges in tunnels, but, you hear these stories about how people are bussed in from other states. And I don't give much credence to that, but
Definitely.
my concern is, we do have nicer weather.
Yeah.
So is there a way to work with other states, so if we're bearing more burden because of the weather, do you guys interact with the other states to support the
So
homelessness?
yeah, there's a
there?
few things that happen in terms of both the interaction with other states, as well as specifically when it comes to any mitigating effects of people coming in. Just to speak to that first point, the way that our system works in Long Beach is that we specifically prioritize and administrate for people experiencing homelessness who are from Long Beach, and oftentimes because of that, people who are experiencing homelessness will go to Los Angeles if that's the case. Like, that's kind of the main hub for people who are bussed in or anything like that. But that's also that narrative of people getting bussed in is a lot less common than you would think. There are some people who do, but it's a very, very small percentage. Most from the numbers that we collect, because part of what's collected on both LAHSA's homeless count and Long Beach's count is where they're from, like how long they've lived in the city. And I think it's about 60% of people across Los Angeles County experiencing homelessness have lived in Los Angeles for over 25 years. So it's often people who are local to the city, and oftentimes even local to the neighborhood. People will stay where they know, because if they're gonna try and travel somewhere else without any resources, it's a very risky and dangerous thing to do. Because they, again, in addition to having to go through other bureaucratic elements, it's just like you don't know where you are. You don't know anything about the place that you're going. So oftentimes that's kind of one of the misconceptions, that it is a larger number than people think because of the weather.
And messaging, right?
I'm sorry?
That's part of your messaging?
Yes, that is part of the 201. So, I mean, we talk about that because it is something that people think about, because yes, we have great weather, and it does incentivize people, I think, more so to live outside, but it doesn't necessarily draw a lot of people flooding in from other states. It might be from other parts of the state. I know that Orange County, for example, has a very larger homeless problem than Long Beach does. And it's because they don't have any facilities at all. They don't even have crisis shelters. So oftentimes they'll try and push people. There is some pushing between cities, but there's not as much state to state. That being said, when it comes to sharing state resources, we have been in contact with other United Ways and other state offices across the United States. We actually recently went to New York and had a conversation about how do we provide long-term consistent housing to people in New York. Because New York has the largest sheltered population of people experiencing homelessness, but they have very little housing for them because it's just so expensive, So they're trying to consider their options here. And so what we're working on right now is kind of the genesis
for a larger movement across the United States. Essentially, we've been in contact with offices in Seattle, San Diego, other places that are, you know, doing this similar kind of work. You first.
Hi, I'm actually from a community-based program. I'm from a sober living here in Long Beach.
Oh, great.
So we'll talk to you about connecting.
Awesome.
My interest is about Orange County and the county-to-county connection. I mean, there's no continuum care there. We can't, and when we get clients that come in from Orange County, you know, either they got picked up, they get, you know, when they clear out, like, you know, the stuff that's going on. We can't get them vouchers because they're not well, we're doing LA County because we can't, because Long Beach doesn't have housing. So we get LA County funding, we can't get LA County funding for them because they're not LA County residents. What's that all about? I mean, it's not like it's another country.
I know. Well, it's two big things. I mean, so yeah, first of all, I just want to, like, for the larger group, importantly, if you don't live in the place where you're trying to receive resources, you can't really receive those resources. It's very difficult. You're deprioritized, which is another reason why people don't move very much. It's just not how our system works. But when people are pushed over, we have a problem because then we can't give them resources and they're just there, right? When it comes to Orange County, the two biggest things that are causing issues are an immovable council and a lot of NIMBYism. People don't want to see the problem, but they don't want to deal with it either. So they'll be very angry that there is homelessness occurring in their city, near their neighborhood or whatever, but they won't throw down any resources to actually solve it. They'll just be like, I don't want him here, push him out, and they'll get the police to, you know, move them. You know, there was a big moving of people who were along the flood control near Angel Stadium where a lot of people were living, and that displaced a few thousand people experiencing homelessness. So that's what we're doing actually right now is we've just started to move into Orange County and worked with the United Way of Orange County to start and use our curriculum to do some housing advocacy out there because they desperately need it. You can't do anything if you don't have any political impetus at all, and there's none right now. That's the whole problem. Despite how crisis level it is, people are so far gone in their own stigmas and misconceptions that they won't do the things that will actually help solve the problems.
Well, and that gets back to that messaging.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been really frustrated because I work with some really nice people. They volunteer in the church. And when you say the word homeless, it's like they blame them.
Yeah.
It's like, and how do you get that message out that that's not the reality?
Absolutely. Like people think, what's frustrating to me a lot is like, people think of people experiencing homelessness as an inconvenience to them. And I'm just like, they don't have a house. How inconvenient is that for them? Like seriously, to be having to try and find a place every day to sleep safely. And oftentimes it's not of their own accord either. It's just because they had unfortunate circumstances that befell them, you know? The most often narrative I see is the snowball effect, where one bill or one occurrence, one unfortunate event will be what flings somebody into homelessness. And especially with our senior population, it's just fixed income, you know, like you have a very set limit as to what you can actually pay for your housing. And if your rent goes up, a lot of covenants for senior housing are ending right now, and it's causing seniors across the city who are renters to now have nowhere to go. So it's things like that we need to start to shift, and that is what the 201 is all about, is practicing those conversations.
Because that's my next question. We are seeing an influx of seniors. It's their first time experiencing home. Most of our folks are repeated homeless people that come and go.
Yeah.
But for many seniors, this is the first time they're coming into shared housing. It is very, very difficult for them.
Definitely.
And there doesn't seem to be any resources specifically for a person who's a senior.
Yeah.
And is there anything on the horizon? Have you heard anything?
The city loves to do studies and studies. The only thing that I've seen happening is that we had like 2 senior studies over the past 2 years, 2016 and 2018. And that's it. That's all that's happened so far. And that's the whole thing. The whole reason we're organizing is because, you know, 20 years ago, this was labeled as a crisis. But back in the early 2000s, people were saying, we have a homelessness crisis in Long Beach. And it's been 20 years and nothing has happened. So what do we do now? You know, it's like we need to make our city council, our government accountable to what is happening. And what that means is actually creating a political movement of people who care about this and know what the actual solutions are. Because, you know, we could have a movement of people who are NIMBYs, like Orange County, and then what happens is you have a lot of people who are angry, but then nothing productive gets done. Our whole trajectory of these trainings, once we go from the messaging, is then like into organizing, right? Organizing tactics, into organizing strategy. And it's about what actually works effectively so that we don't burn people out, that we use our time effectively, and that we're actually targeting the people that are going to give us what we want. So that's the whole idea around what we're doing, and that's why we're doing it, essentially.
Returning to the idea of network effects.
Mhm.
So your organization is dealing with the immediate problem of getting people off the streets into housing, but is
Yes.
there any interaction or coordination among groups that might be advocating for higher minimum wages,
Oh, yeah.
higher social safety nets, regulatory reforms so that developers can build affordable housing
Oh,
for
absolutely.
profit without, okay, that's.
Yeah, no, we work very actively with that. In fact, in some circumstances, we actually advocate for that kind of legislation. Some of the most recent ones were statewide. There's SB 450, which is one that says that it makes it easier for nuisance motels to be converted into supportive and affordable housing by exempting them from CEQA examinations, because the same environmental regulations are already built in to the process of covenanting a house. CEQA, which is like environmental regulations essentially, for any new development, is often used to slow down developments, oftentimes for good reasons. But when it comes to supportive and affordable housing, oftentimes it's a NIMBY device. And it's extra unfortunate because usually those kinds of requirements are already folded in to the needs and what it means to actually get this kind of funding. So fortunately that kind of stuff has been cleared. And there's other hurdles that we've been working with housing organizations that aren't like developers, but more like tenants' rights, that work with like legal changes. We've been working with a few council members as well as a few organizations around jobs trainings programs and actually getting those on the ground. Fight for 15 as well is someone that we've engaged in terms of, you know, actually advocating for higher minimum wages and you know, better circumstances for jobs. And if you look at our full community profile, like I could keep going, but like we have a very vast list of partners where we try and support along the way to make sure that, like, you know, like we said, we don't want any gaps in the system. And what that takes is it does take everyone in walking in step. Housing is a big part of the solution, and that's one of the biggest gaps that we have. But we need to make sure that we have community partners along the way that like work stepwise, you know, because every step that you take, you're gonna need, you know, a few agencies. And right now we have a lot of agencies, but they're not really synced up. They're all kind of in their own little silos. And so our goal is to kind of get everybody on the same page and know what they're doing. So, short answer, yes. Visitor, yes.
My question is, I live fairly near the VA.
Mm-hmm.
So do they do something about homelessness? Because there are a fair number of homeless people that hang out near there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the largest resources for veterans experiencing homelessness. We did have a housing program for them that the mayor was working on, and I think he celebrates that, you know, we housed some more homeless veterans, which is great. But there's still a small capacity because, again, we don't receive consistent funding for housing. So because of that, with the VA acting as basically the biggest service provider for veterans experiencing homelessness, you have a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness still there because it's just easier to get to, you know? It's on a far side of town. That's the same when it comes to like the MSC. Like the reason a lot of people stay along the 710 corridor is because that's also where a lot of the resources for people experiencing homelessness are. If you'll notice, the way that we construct a lot of our resources is that they're at disparate ends of the city. You have one literally as far north as you can go in Long Beach, you have one as far west as you can go in Long Beach, you have one as far east as you can go in Long Beach. They're literally as magnetically opposed to the center as possible. And now we're starting to get a little bit of supportive housing in the center, which is great, but that looks like changing neighborhood advocacy right there. That looks like changing the minds of people within the neighborhoods.
So that earlier slide that you showed,
Mhm.
the great share of people who said they would support
Yeah.
supportive housing in their neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
is that consistent throughout the city, or were you able to break that down?
Now that I don't know the breakdown, and I'm curious about that, I would estimate that it is lower in Long Beach because we generally have a more conservative voter base. And, you know, even looking within like the smaller parts of the city, like knowing what that would look like is is definitely interesting to me. We are doing some polling right now, actually, specifically for Long Beach, to find out, you know, what is the best route for politically in terms of like getting the funding, right? What's going to work best. And so that will expose a lot more of like what parts of the city, you know, do and don't support this. I already have a mental image of that, personally, just from living in Long Beach. But what I can tell you is that yes, even within Long Beach, there is a majority of people. I just don't know the number. I think it's around 60% rather than 70%. There's like a little bit of a gap.
Are you working with the city council? Do you have support from them?
Yes, actually, very actively. We're working very actively with Councilmember Rex Richardson. He's kind of been like helping champion a lot of the political work that we're doing. We've met with every council office at least a few times from every district, and we're trying to keep them as involved in the conversation as we can, especially as we move into 2020. We're going to be much more intentional about talking to them. One of the things that we've been doing is we've been creating neighborhood leader groups in each individual district. So if you want to be a part of that, keep coming to these trainings, because those groups of individuals will be meeting with those council members as the months move on. That's the plan. So, yeah. Other questions?
I gotta go back to funding.
Yeah. I have a lot of question marks there, so
Yeah,
yeah.
Even if you have, you know, heartfelt support from every neighborhood, to get that built, I mean, it's very pretty, but you need millions of dollars.
Yeah,
It's not
that's
going to
true.
come from the city. Cities don't have that kind of, you need the incentive for private developers to be able to build affordable housing or supportive housing,
Yeah.
and a private developer's gotta have an incentive also.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've gotta be looking at the state and federal level.
That is also happening too.
And so what's
statewide
my
one-
agenda? What do I do?
So, okay. So the first most important thing is to come to the rest of these trainings, because within the month of December, there will be some conversations around the actual political element of this, locally, the local element. So our focus, specifically what I'm advocating for, is going to be the local funding source. So that will be our focus for the next year. And we'll talk about what that looks like over the next few months, right? There are more larger advocacy elements happening outside of like my purview that our organization as a whole is advocating for, and that the city of Long Beach is advocating for. In the next year, we're gonna receive another HEAP money, another like few $1 million of HEAP, right? Which was what we received this past year to help build the year-round shelter. And that again can go immediately into housing resources. What I hear whispers of right now is that that's actually mostly gonna go to Section 8 housing, which like, that's good, because the people who do have vouchers right now will be able to now have some funded rent, which is great. That's some immediate relief, right? The idea is though, we just passed a housing bond across the state. It's like $1.3 billion or something like that. Actually, I think it's larger. But right now what's happening is that money is getting parceled out as to who's gonna get it. And essentially, who is going to get the most money out of that pot are the people who are already funding that source locally. That's what's been said about this bond from Governor Newsom. Is that, you know, he wants this bond to be competitive amongst cities, and he wants to give the money to the cities that are doing the groundwork. So if we don't have a municipal funding source, that makes us look a lot less appealing for state funding. So all of this, when we're talking about funding, it does get very political, because it's like we're constantly in dialogue trying to get these resources as quickly as we can. And just like, you know, anything else, when you're on the market, you want to be as competitive as you can be. That's the real importance about the local municipal funding, is that if we open that door, it opens doors to a lot of other funding sources along the way.
Jordan, you raised a really good issue, and Renee has raised it a couple of times. I'm a grant manager. I receive grants from the federal government to my city agency. But we have to put some skin in the game. We have a 25% cost share. So what Jordan's alluding to is the fact that the federal government and the state government want the city to have some skin in the game. They're not just gonna hand them money without a commitment from the city that the city's going to put some of its money into solving the problem.
And this is especially true with the COC that we have, because we administrate our own funding. it puts even more onus on us to have a more effective system. Every year, the Housing and Urban Development will give us an evaluation of our COC, of our continuum of care, as to how we're doing. And we're not doing the worst, we're doing like average about, but the big place that we're losing points is on housing. We got like a 0 out of 10 on that category. And if we were to score higher, if we were in the highest percentile, we would receive more funding from the federal government for our COC. So that's the reason why this is important. We have to be competitive. That's how we get more resources. If we start locally, if we show that we're willing to invest as a community, it will exponentially increase the benefits that we have to our city and our city's homeless
You
population.
also have to have a plan.
This is true.
You know, the money is one thing, but if you don't have a plan laid out for effective use,
Yep.
you're not gonna get it.
That is true. That's why it's important that last year the Everyone Home Task Force met and assembled that kind of plan. In 2018, there were a whole bunch of different stakeholders throughout the city of Long Beach that came together from a lot of different departments, medical, educational. So we had, James Close Connolly, for example, Memorial Healthcare. A lot of large labor partners as well came together and talked about, okay, so what do we want to see when it comes to actually administrating homelessness in Long Beach? What are we missing and how we utilize this funding? That's where we got that layout of the specific usage of the funding, the breakdown of the 245 million. So they had it all budgeted out as for what they were going to spend it on. Now I have to agree with you there though, that like, in addition to that, we need to make sure that the city is using that funding effectively. I see us both as a political advocacy group and as well as an enforcement mechanism. Because what we are as a people generally is that enforcement mechanism. We are the voters. We're the ones who are supposed to be represented by our government. And when they are not, stepping up to par, we need to be able to raise our voices. So we're training you to raise your voice at any point in time. So everywhere from the very beginning, when we're advocating for things, to once we actually do get the funding, then what it moves towards there, our next phase is what everyone else in Los Angeles is doing, which is actually advocating site by site and talking very specifically with our local governments to make sure that they're allocating the funds in the most effective and efficient ways possible. So we exist past this campaign. It's not just like, we get this money and then, oh yay, we're done, celebrate, yay, the city of Long Beach is totally gonna spend this like completely perfectly. From here is where we move into what everywhere else in LA is doing right now. I'm actually kind of the odd person out where like, I'm the only campaign that has to advocate for funding right now because I'm working the only place that doesn't have it right now. Everyone else in Los Angeles that's on my team is currently in the second phase. The funding exists and they need to find the places and ways to utilize that as effectively, quickly, and efficiently as possible. So that's what my job is going to become past this. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's very important that we do that. Any other questions?
Yeah, so was it last year that there was a lot of community activism against?
Around this time, actually, last year. November 2018, there was what people termed the Homeless Vigilante Group, which was a group of people in Belmont Shore that came together and said, we're fed up with homelessness here, we're just gonna push everybody out. And so their plan was to assemble like 20 or so people to go and harass people on the beach, get them to move their stuff and get out of, the public beach along, Belmont Shore. There was also a larger counter protest that turned up at the same time and said, hey, what you're doing is messed up, please don't do this. And that sparked a community dialogue. That was actually when I was starting this position, was around that time last year. So I jumped into a very interesting time. And I can tell you a few interesting things about that. One is that in all of our activism, we don't want to get super caught up with combating the opposition. That's where oftentimes we tend to think we want to go because it's so easy to argue with somebody. But if it's not going to be productive, if they're not going to change their minds, why waste the time? Instead, it would be a lot more productive to actually talk with allies, talk with people who are on the fence, who want to learn more information and learn why this is important, right? What was interesting about that debate was there was this dude who was just like the entire time yelling at all of the homeless advocates, like really mean things. And I mean, he was drunk too, so like that added to it. But I ended up taking him aside, and like for 30 minutes, we had a conversation. First 15, I just kind of let him ramble, but the whole method, this is something you'll learn at 201, is like, you want to start to find some common ground. You can't operate and like actually change somebody's mind if you don't have common ground with them, right? So I let him ramble for 15 minutes and kind of started to work down. The first question I started with was start with why, right? Why do you think this? Or like, what have you experienced? Oh, you've talked with this person. Because he was saying that he had talked with somebody who was experiencing long-term homelessness, who lived close to him. And I was like, oh, well, what is that interaction like? What does that look like? And you know, you start to unearth some misconceptions, right? Like, and then once we got to this baseline where he basically arrived at this point where like, you know, hey, like I really empathize with this guy. Like I see him every day, but it just feels like he doesn't want to get better, blah, 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 you know, all these sorts of things. And we got to a leveling point right there, right? We got a misconception, but we also got common ground, right? Where I can say, hey, so it's really great that you want to help. And I also think that there's a lot of ways in which we're not helping right now where we could be more effective and there's lost ground. And so then I started bringing up the importance of housing resources. I started bringing up like what it looks like when we move somebody and why this person might be in the circumstance where, you know, it seems that he doesn't want help, but maybe it's, you know, because he couldn't get the help so many times. I bring up some of the city statistics. We start telling stories a little bit more, and by the end of that night, he's like, hey, you know, you really like gave me a lot of information tonight. I really appreciated that. I want to learn more from you. Here's my card. I'll get in contact with you. And so since then, you know, we've talked a little bit more, and he's definitely warmed up to the idea of, hey, like, if we're gonna solve this problem, we actually do need some substantial change. It's not just about moving people around. And so that's where we need to get, you know, even with people who on the surface might seem, you know, immovable, and there are certainly people who are like that, and in that case, don't waste your time. But a lot of the times, it's just about finding common ground and being able to like address the issues and the misconceptions that people have with facts and storytelling, the things that, you know, we need to actually understand and get a full picture of how we help somebody.
Well, and I think that falls under your messaging.
It
You know,
does.
I think a lot of it is that fear factor, so like when she brought up, you know, they hear that there's terrible disease or these,
Yeah.
or they, like I said, we hear the stories about being bussed in, and what a lot of people say is, well, they're bussed in because California gives out free money, we're a welfare state. And you can't, that fear of, or they see the drug use in some of these communities.
Exactly, yeah.
And you can't get past that, and it is so frustrating to try, I mean, you're an expert because you have the knowledge, the rest of us don't, to break through that fear factor.
Exactly, yeah. That's, and I am teasing the 201 a lot. If you want to jump in depth at the 201, we will be practicing a lot of this. The whole idea of this training is to get you more comfortable with doing that kind of communication and really internalizing these facts and stories a little bit better. But yeah, no, that's like what it's all about, is moving from these, you know, bouts of confirmation bias where people see one scenario and they think it's everything, you know, like we want to show people that, hey, every story of homelessness is different, and we need the resources that actually adapt to that rather than just saying no, or these, you know, whatever people say. So, yeah.
Well, what happened with Judge Carter's clearing out all the homeless camps in Orange County and putting them in motels, basically, and paying for motels for a period of time? And that was all in the LA Times a lot, but nothing since. Now, what happened to those people back in camps?
It's very likely. I wouldn't doubt it. It's either they're getting.
You know, I
they're,
think studying that experience would be useful.
Yeah, I
Because
agree.
Judge Carter was most emphatic that this was something he wanted cleared, and then I don't think anything happened.
Well, one thing that happened is they sued to try to get him off the case.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. It's continuously happening in Orange County. So.
He has business in Orange County.
Woo! I realize we're about 5 minutes from 12, so I don't know if anyone else has any business, but. One more?
Do you ever deal with our realtor organization in town?
Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's actually some realtors who are partnered with our organizations and with the campaign's efforts. It's surprising, right? There's a few. Frontier Realty is a big one, for example, that has shown their support for some sort of funding mechanism for this. And they're constantly being engaged. Actually, a lot of that dirty work is happening via some of our council allies, which is great because I probably would not be the best person to talk to a realty group. So we are having actually active conversations around that. I mean, obviously there are going to be some that are more conservative than others. So, you know, we don't need everybody, but we want to try at least to get everybody in. So, yeah. That's about it.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And Jane has an announcement to make.
Thank you, Jordan, thank you
Of
very much.
course, appreciate being here.
All right, so those, we do have the sign-up sheet in the back, so if you didn't sign up on your way in, please sign up on your way out. We also, thanks to Lisa, have some straws, some reusable straws that you can keep in your purse and take with you. And they have our logo on there and our website on there, so please help yourself and take one of those. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. We have a holiday party coming up in December, and then we will be at the aquarium in January. So, thank you.